August 25, 1942, 2:47 a.m. Milne Bay, Papua New Guinea. Private Kenneth McRae, 19, from Brisbane, crouched behind a palm tree as darkness exploded around him. Japanese landing barges scraped onto the beach 50 yards ahead. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The wet season had turned Milne Bay into a swamp. Rain hammered down. McRae's boots sank 6 inches into mud with each step. Behind him, 23 men from the 61st Battalion waited in positions they'd dug 3 days earlier. The positions were already filling with water. What McRae didn't know, within 12 days, this beach would witness the first Japanese land defeat of the entire Pacific War. Machine gun fire erupted from the barges. Tracers cut red lines through the rain. McRae pressed his face into the mud. The smell of rotting vegetation mixed with cordite. His section commander, Corporal Davies, crawled forward. No words needed. Davies pointed toward the tree line. They had to fall back. But falling back meant abandoning the prepared positions. It meant giving the Japanese a foothold. McRae thought of his mother's last letter, still in his pack. She'd written about the garden at home, about normal things. The barges kept coming. McRae counted 12, then lost track. Japanese Marines poured onto the beach. They moved with precision despite the mud and darkness. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Intelligence had warned about Special Naval Landing Forces, Japan's elite amphibious troops. Each man trained 4 years, each one convinced of victory. Could the Australians hold? 1,600 miles south, in Port Moresby, Major General Cyril Close studied maps in a command tent. The 42-year-old from Tasmania had inherited an impossible situation. He commanded the Milne Force, 8,500 Allied troops scattered across 3 airstrips in a malarial swamp. Most were militia, not frontline infantry. Many had never seen combat. The airstrips mattered more than anything. Allied bombers needed them to strike Japanese bases in Rabaul. Without Milne Bay, the entire New Guinea campaign could collapse. Tokyo knew this. That's why they sent the Kure 5th Special Naval Landing Force, 750 of Japan's finest Marines. Clowes received the warning at midnight. Japanese convoy spotted approaching from the east. He'd immediately ordered the 7th Brigade to defensive positions along the coastal track. But coordination in darkness, in rain, with no radios that worked reliably, it might not be enough. The numbers looked grim. His frontline strength, roughly 2,100 combat troops. Behind them, support personnel, engineers, American construction crews. But the Japanese had something else, something that changed calculations. They had momentum. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces hadn't lost a single land campaign, not in Malaya, not in the Philippines, not in the Dutch East Indies. Their reputation preceded them. Unstoppable in jungle warfare, masters of night operations, willing to die, rather than surrender. Back on the beach, McRae and his section reached the secondary line. The 210th Battalion held positions there, better troops, better armed. Lieutenant Colonel Dobbs, 38, from Melbourne, commanded the battalion. He'd fought in North Africa. He recognized panic when he saw it. Dobbs grabbed McRae's shoulder. His voice stayed calm despite the chaos. He explained the plan. Let the Japanese advance into the killing zone. The rain would cover repositioning. Machine guns positioned in interlocking fields of fire. When the Japanese reached the designated point, open up. But first they had to survive the next 20 minutes. Japanese mortars began dropping rounds. The explosions threw mud 20 feet high. Shrapnel whined through the air. McRae heard screaming from the forward positions. Someone calling for a medic. The sound cut off abruptly. The rain intensified. Visibility dropped to arm's length. McRae couldn't see the Japanese advancing, but he heard them. Boots sucking in mud. Equipment rattling. Low voices coordinating movement. They were getting closer. While McRae waited in the darkness, 12 miles west, Squadron Leader Peter Turnbull, 27 from Sydney, stood beside his P-40 Kittyhawk at No. 3 strip. The rain hammered his aircraft's metal skin. He couldn't fly in this weather. Dawn was still 3 hours away. But he knew what dawn would bring. The Japanese landing meant one thing. They'd have air support. 0 fighters, probably. Maybe bombers. Turnbull's squadron, number 75, had 18 serviceable Kittyhawks. Against what? He didn't know. Nobody knew Japanese strength in the area. What made it worse? The strip itself. 3,000 feet of pierced steel planking laid over swamp. When it rained, water pooled on the runway. When Kittyhawks landed, they hydroplaned. 2 aircraft had already flipped. The wreckage sat beside the strip as reminder. Turnbull thought about his ground crew. They worked through nights, keeping the fighters operational. Humidity corroded everything. Fungus grew in fuel lines. Spark plugs fouled within hours. Yet somehow they kept birds flying. His mechanic, Sergeant Walsh, appeared through the rain. Walsh carried bad news written on his face. The fuel situation had gotten worse. Supply convoy delayed. Current stocks, maybe 3 days of combat operations. After that, the Kittyhawks became expensive lawn ornaments. The numbers seemed impossible. 18 fighters, limited fuel, unknown enemy strength, worst weather conditions imaginable. But Allied intelligence confirmed it. The Japanese were coming in force. At 4:15 a.m., the Japanese attacked. They came in waves, just as their doctrine prescribed. First wave, suppressive fire. Second wave, assault troops. Third wave, consolidation. McRae saw them emerge from the darkness. 50 yards, 40, 30. He lined up his rifle sights. His hands had stopped shaking. Fear transformed into something else, something colder. Dobbs gave the order. Every weapon opened fire simultaneously. The sound was overwhelming. Bren guns, rifles, grenades. The Japanese first wave went down like wheat before a scythe, but the second wave kept coming. They advanced over their own dead, without hesitation. That's when McRae understood what they faced. These weren't soldiers who would break under fire. These were fanatics who considered death an honor. The realization hit like cold water. How do you stop men who don't fear dying? The battle compressed into minutes of pure chaos. Japanese Marines broke through at 2 points. Hand-to-hand fighting in the mud. McRae saw Corporal Davies grappling with a Japanese soldier. Both men slipped, fell, rose, fought. Davies got his knife out first. By 5:30 a.m., the Japanese pulled back. They left bodies scattered across the beach and the first 100 yards of jungle. Australian casualties, 27 dead, 48 wounded, but they'd held the line. Dawn revealed the true scale. The Japanese hadn't just landed one force, they'd established a beachhead. Engineers were already unloading supplies, artillery pieces, ammunition. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion. Clouds received the reports as gray light spread across Port Moresby. The Japanese held the beach. They'd advanced 3 miles inland. They controlled the coastal track. Worse, they were moving toward Airstrip 3. If they captured it, the other 2 strips became untenable. Would the Australians have to withdraw? The question hung unspoken. 300 miles northwest, at Port Moresby's fighter control, Wing Commander William Gehring, 35, from Perth, studied reconnaissance photographs. The images showed Japanese positions with brutal clarity. The enemy had brought heavy weapons, Type 92 battalion guns, Type 11 light machine guns, enough ammunition for sustained operations. Gehring commanded RAAF operations for the entire Milne Bay sector. His resources: 2 squadrons of Kittyhawks, 1 squadron of Hudson bombers, and maintenance crews working miracles with deteriorating equipment. His mission: stop the Japanese advance using air power alone. Ground forces couldn't hold without air support, but how do you provide air support in a swamp where visibility rarely exceeded 500 yards? The answer came from an unexpected source. Flight Lieutenant Bruce Anderson, 24, from Adelaide, had been flying reconnaissance over Milne Bay for 3 weeks. He discovered something crucial about the weather patterns. The rain came in cycles. Between squalls, brief windows opened, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes less. During those windows, Visibility improved dramatically. Anderson proposed a radical solution. Instead of waiting for clear weather that might never come, launch aircraft during the windows, fly low under the cloud base, strike Japanese positions before the next squall hit, get back before the weather closed in completely. The plan violated every doctrine about safe flying operations. Cloud base sometimes dropped to 300 feet. The jungle canopy reached 200 feet. That left 100 feet of operational space. One mistake meant flying into trees at 200 miles per hour. Goring held a briefing at 9:15 a.m. 12 pilots crowded into the operations tent. Rain drummed overhead. He explained Anderson's plan. Several pilots exchanged glances. One spoke up. Flying below 300 feet, in rain, over jungle, with Japanese anti-aircraft guns waiting, the odds didn't look good. What they didn't know, those odds were about to shift. Turnbull volunteered immediately. He'd flown in worse conditions over Darwin. At least, that's what he told himself. He selected 3 other pilots for the first mission. They'd hit Japanese positions on the coastal track, strafe landing areas, force the enemy to disperse. But first they needed current intelligence. Where exactly were the Japanese? What air defenses had they established? How many troops? Standard reconnaissance couldn't answer these questions. The weather prevented high-altitude observation. The solution came from the ground. The 210th Battalion had infiltrated scouts forward. These men, mostly from rural Australia, knew jungle craft. They moved through terrain the Japanese considered impenetrable. They observed enemy positions from yards away, then melted back into the undergrowth. One scout, Private Tom Mitchell, 22 from Queensland, reached Australian lines at 10:30 a.m. His uniform was caked with mud. Leeches covered his legs, but his information was gold. He'd counted Japanese positions, marked machine gun nests on a map, identified ammunition dumps. Most importantly, he'd spotted something unexpected. The Japanese had no radar. They relied on visual spotting for air defense. In this weather, that meant they'd never see the Kittyhawks coming until seconds before attack. The element of surprise would be total. Mitchell's report changed everything. Turnbull revised the mission plan. Instead of high-speed slashing attacks, they'd make multiple passes. First pass, identify targets. Second pass, strafe with 50 caliber machine guns. Third pass, drop 30-pound fragmentation bombs. The Japanese wouldn't have time to organize effective anti-aircraft fire. Could 4 fighters really make a difference against an invasion force? At 11:47 a.m., the weather window opened. Turnbull led his flight off number 3 strip. The takeoff was treacherous. Water sprayed from the wheels. The Kittyhawk behind him nearly skidded into the jungle, but all 4 aircraft got airborne. They flew east at 300 feet. The coastline appeared through gaps in the rain. Turnbull spotted the Japanese beachhead immediately. Landing barges lined the shore, supplies stacked in the open, troops moving in columns along the track. He rolled into the attack. His 650 caliber machine guns opened fire. Tracers walked across the beach. Japanese soldiers scattered. Some dove for cover. Others stood and fired rifles uselessly at the fighters roaring past. The second Kittyhawk followed, then the third, then the fourth. They made 3 passes in 4 minutes. When they pulled up and headed west, smoke rose from 6 locations. Bodies littered the beach. The surviving Japanese had gone to ground, but the real impact wasn't the casualties. It was psychological. The Japanese had expected air superiority. They'd been promised 0 fighters would control the skies. Instead, Australian fighters operated with impunity. The invincible image began to crack. Back at number 3 strip, Turnbull's aircraft touched down at 12:03 p.m., 16 minutes airborne, 0 losses. The mechanics swarmed the fighters immediately. Refuel, rearm, get them ready for the next sortie. Walsh reported battle damage, bullet holes in 2 aircraft, nothing serious. More concerning, fuel consumption. The low-altitude attacks burned fuel faster than calculated. With current stocks, they could maintain operations for maybe 48 hours. After that, the Kittyhawks would be grounded. While the fighters refueled, intelligence analyzed the attack results. Scouts reported Japanese disorganization. The enemy advance had halted. They were digging defensive positions instead of pushing forward. The air attacks had bought time. But how much? At Australian headquarters, Close faced a decision. The Japanese held superior positions. They had veteran troops. They had the initiative. But the Kittyhawks had proved they could strike effectively. Should he commit his infantry to counterattack while the enemy was disorganized, or consolidate defensive positions and let air power do the work? The debate split his staff. The infantry commanders wanted to attack immediately. The air liaison officer argued for continued airstrikes. Close listened to both sides. Then he made his choice. He would do both. Infantry would pressure the Japanese on the ground, forcing them to bunch up. The Kittyhawks would hit those concentrations from above. Combined arms, the way modern warfare should be fought. But executing the plan required coordination beyond anything attempted in this theater. Radio communications barely functioned. Visual signals couldn't work in the rain. Timing would depend on runners carrying messages through the jungle. One mistake, and Australian infantry could be hit by their own aircraft. The risk seemed staggering. Friendly fire incidents, communication breakdowns, missions launched in marginal weather. But the alternative was worse, abandoning Milne Bay to the Japanese. That afternoon, the second wave launched. 6 Kittyhawks this time. They caught Japanese troops concentrated near the village of KB Mission. The attack was devastating. Machine gun fire ripped through exposed infantry. Bombs detonated among supply dumps. Secondary explosions indicated ammunition strikes. One pilot, Flying Officer James Barber, 23 from Victoria, pressed his attack too close. Japanese return fire hit his engine. Coolant streamed from the radiator. The Allison V-1710 began overheating immediately. Barber had minutes before seizure. He coaxed the dying fighter west. The engine temperature climbed past red line. Oil pressure dropped. 3 miles from the strip, the engine quit. Barber glided the final distance. He touched down without power, rolled to a stop 50 feet from the end of the runway. Mechanics reached him before he climbed from the cockpit. His hands were steady, but his face was white. The damage report sobered everyone. The engine was destroyed. No spares existed in theater. Barber's Kittyhawk would never fly again. The operational count dropped to 17 aircraft. As darkness fell on August 25th, both sides assessed the situation. The Japanese held their beachhead, but hadn't advanced. The Australians held the airstrips, but couldn't dislodge the enemy. The battle had reached stalemate. What happened next would determine whether Japan continued its undefeated streak or suffered its first land defeat of the war. August 26, 1942, 6:15 a.m. KB Mission Area. Sergeant Jack Morrison, 28, from rural New South Wales, led his patrol through swamp that reached chest high. His 10 men moved in single file. They'd been behind Japanese lines for 6 hours. Their mission: locate enemy artillery positions. Morrison had grown up hunting in swamps. He understood how sound traveled over water, how to move without creating ripples, how to disappear into vegetation that seemed too sparse for concealment. These skills mattered more than any military training. Ahead, voices. Japanese. Morrison froze. His patrol froze. They waited 30 seconds. The voices moved away. Morrison eased forward another 20 yards. Then he saw them. 3 Type 92 battalion guns, 70mm caliber, positioned in a clearing 200 yards from the coastal track. Ammunition stacked nearby, perhaps 40 rounds per gun. Gun crews resting in crude shelters, no sentries visible. Morrison marked the position on his map. Grid coordinates, distance from landmarks, number of weapons. He sketched the layout. Every detail mattered. Then he began the extraction. His patrol retraced their path, slow, silent. professional. They reached Australian lines at 9:30 a.m. Morrison's information went straight to close. The artillery posed a major threat. Those guns could interdict the coastal track. They could hit the airstrips. They had to be neutralized. But how? Ground assault through swamp against prepared positions would cost dozens of casualties. The alternative, precision airstrike. But could the Kittyhawk pilots hit targets in dense jungle based on map coordinates alone? 5 miles west at the airfield, Turnbull studied Morrison's sketch. The artillery position sat in a clearing barely 60 yards across. Trees surrounded it on all sides. To hit the target, pilots would need to dive through a gap in the canopy, release bombs at the exact moment, and pull up before hitting trees on the far side. Margin for error, 0. Could it be done? The question hung in the humid air. Turnbull decided to try. He selected his most experienced pilot, Flight Lieutenant Duncan Cameron, 29, from New Zealand. Cameron had flown ground attack missions in North Africa. He understood precision bombing, but North Africa had clear skies and open desert. This was jungle and rain. They launched at 11 a.m., 2 Kittyhawks. Cameron's aircraft carried 4 30-pound bombs. Turnbull would fly observer, mark the target with machine gun fire. They flew the bearing Morrison had provided, 5 minutes to target. The weather was worse than briefed. Cloud base at 250 feet. Rain reduced visibility to quarter mile. Cameron flew at 200 feet, scanning the jungle below. Everything looked identical. Green canopy, no landmarks, no clearing visible. Then Turnbull spotted it, a gap in the trees. He rolled left, dove toward it, opened fire. Tracers marked the position. Cameron swung into attack run. He saw the clearing, saw the guns, saw Japanese troops scattering. He released at 150 feet, too high. The bombs fell wide, exploding in the swamp. Cameron cursed, circled for second pass. The Japanese were ready now. Rifle fire crackled. Bullets pinged off his aircraft. Second run. Cameron went lower. 100 feet. He could see individual soldiers. Released bombs. 2 hit the clearing. Explosions among the gun positions. Smoke, debris. But had he hit the guns? They circled once more. Through the smoke, Cameron saw 1 gun overturned, another damaged. The third appeared intact, but the crew had fled. Good enough. They turned west. While Cameron and Turnbull flew back to base, the situation on the ground was deteriorating. The Japanese had probed Australian positions throughout the morning. Small unit actions, testing defenses, looking for weak points. They found one. The junction between the 61st Battalion and the 210th Battalion created a seam in the defensive line. Not much, a 100-yard gap through particularly dense swamp that commanders assumed was impassable. The Japanese infiltrated through it. By 2 p.m., Japanese troops had established positions behind Australian forward lines. They hit supply routes, ambushed patrols, created chaos in the rear areas. The Australian defense began fragmenting. At Port Moresby, Clowes received the reports with growing concern. His forces were militia-facing elite Japanese Marines. His supply lines were threatened. His air support was limited by weather and fuel. If the Japanese launched a coordinated push, could the defense hold? The answer arrived from an unexpected direction. 300 miles north, at Rabaul, Japanese commanders faced their own crisis. The invasion force had expected to capture Milne Bay in 48 hours. They were now behind schedule. Casualties exceeded projections. Air support had failed to materialize. Worst of all, those Australian fighters kept attacking. Japanese Admiral Mikawa ordered reinforcements. The Sasebo 5th Special Naval Landing Force would reinforce the Kure 5th, another 540 elite Marines, plus additional supplies and ammunition. The convoy would arrive August 29th. What Mikawa didn't know, Allied code breakers had intercepted his orders. At MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane, intelligence officers decoded the Japanese transmissions. They passed the information to Clowes within hours. He now knew exactly when and where the Japanese reinforcements would land. The question was whether he could stop them. The answer depended on weather. The RAAF needed clear conditions to intercept the convoy, but the weather forecast showed continued rain, low clouds, poor visibility. The Japanese had chosen their timing well. Unless something changed, the reinforcements would land unopposed. The Japanese force would nearly double. The Australian defense would face overwhelming odds. Milne Bay would fall. The entire New Guinea campaign would collapse. That night, August 26th, both sides prepared for decisive action. The Japanese consolidated their positions. They brought ammunition forward. They prepared for major offensive. Their intelligence indicated Australian morale was cracking. One more push would break the defense. The Australians had different plans. Close ordered the 212th Battalion forward. Fresh troops, well trained. They would counterattack at dawn, driving toward the Japanese beachhead. Simultaneously, the Kittyhawks would strike. Maximum effort. Every serviceable aircraft. But midnight brought new complications. Heavy rain flooded number 3 strip. Water pooled 4 inches deep in places. The pierced steel planking shifted. Taking off in these conditions risked losing aircraft to accidents. Yet without air support, the infantry counterattack would fail. Turnbull inspected the runway with flashlights. The water wasn't draining. The strip was nearly unusable. He calculated takeoff distance required versus available runway. The numbers didn't work. Loaded Kittyhawks needed 3,000 feet. The safe portion of the runway, maybe 2,500. Walsh approached with a suggestion. Remove the bombs. Carry only ammunition for the machine guns. Lighter aircraft would need less runway. Turnbull considered it. Less payload meant less damage, but some support was better than none. He made the decision. Tomorrow's mission, guns only. Maximum ammunition load. They'd make up for lighter ordnance with more passes over target. It would expose them to more ground fire, but there was no alternative. At 4:30 a.m., August 27th, the Australian infantry moved into position. The 212th Battalion formed up in darkness. Rain continued falling. Men checked weapons, loaded magazines, wrote quick letters home just in case. The counterattack would begin at dawn. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Arnold, 37 from Sydney, walked the line. He spoke quietly with company commanders. The objective was simple. Advance 2 miles, overrun Japanese forward positions, push them back to the beach. Simple but not easy. Japanese machine guns covered the coastal track. Mortars were pre-registered on likely approach routes. The terrain favored defense, but Arnold had one advantage. His men were fighting for something beyond military objectives. They were proving Australians could stand against Japan's finest. National pride drove them forward. As gray light spread across the jungle, the artillery barrage began. Australian 25-pounders fired from positions west of the airstrips. Shells screamed overhead. Explosions erupted in Japanese-held territory. The barrage lasted 15 minutes. Then silence. Arnold gave the order. The 212th Battalion advanced. They moved fast, using the smoke from the barrage for concealment. They covered 300 yards before Japanese fire erupted. Then the real battle began. August 27, 1942, 6:42 a.m., coastal track near KB Mission. Captain James Stewart, 31 from Melbourne, led D Company through chest-high kunai grass. Machine gun fire cut the grass around them. Stewart's men went to ground. Ahead, Japanese bunkers covered the track. Well constructed, mutually supporting, professional work. Stewart assessed the situation. Direct assault would be suicide. Flanking movement through swamp would take hours. His company was pinned. He needed support. Where were the Kittyhawks? Could they arrive in time? At that moment, 800 yards away, Corporal Eddie Walsh, from Brisbane's western suburbs, crouched with his Bren gun team. Japanese mortars were dropping rounds methodically along the Australian line. Walsh heard one coming, the distinctive whistle. He pressed into mud. The explosion threw dirt over his position. His ears rang, but he was alive. His section commander crawled up. They needed to move. The mortars had their range. Walsh grabbed his Bren gun. 28 pounds of weapon and ammunition. In the mud, it felt like 50. He struggled to his feet, started moving. A burst of machine gun fire. Walsh dove, too late. Rounds hit his left leg. 2 impacts. He went down hard. The pain came seconds later. Searing. His leg wouldn't respond. The section commander was beside him immediately, applying field dressing. Blood soaked through. Walsh thought about his wife, about the baby daughter he'd never met. She'd been born 3 months after he deployed. He'd only seen photographs. Would he see her? The question burned more than the leg wounds. 2 men dragged him toward the rear. Every movement sent lightning through his leg. They reached the aid station, a crude shelter with a doctor and 2 medics, handling 30 casualties. The doctor took one look, made his assessment. Walsh would survive, but his war was over. While Walsh received treatment 200 yards west, Lieutenant Bob Matthews, 25 from Adelaide, discovered the Japanese flank. His platoon had pushed through supposedly impassable swamp. They emerged behind enemy positions. Matthews saw Japanese soldiers manning a machine gun, their backs exposed. His men opened fire. The Japanese went down without firing a shot. Matthews pressed the advantage. His platoon swept the position. They captured the machine gun intact, a Type 96 Japanese Army's standard weapon. More importantly, they'd created a gap in enemy defenses. He radioed back. Battalion command ordered exploitation immediately, but the Japanese reacted faster than expected. A counterattack force, 20 Marines, led by an officer with sword drawn, charged Matthews' position. The range closed rapidly, 50 yards, 40, 30. Matthews' men fired. The Japanese kept coming. They closed to bayonet range. The fighting became brutal. Hand to hand in the mud, Matthews used his pistol at point-blank range. Empty, he grabbed a shovel, swung it like an axe. The Japanese officer went down. The counterattack broke. Surviving Japanese fled. Matthews stood among bodies, breathing hard. His hands shook. Battle fatigue hit like a wave. But there was no time. More Japanese were coming. He reorganized his platoon. They had to hold this position. What Matthews didn't realize, his action had opened the way for the main assault. At 7:23 a.m., 3 miles west, Turnbull led 6 Kittyhawks off the flooded runway. The takeoff was harrowing. Water sprayed from wheels. One aircraft hydroplaned, nearly lost control, but all 6 got airborne. They climbed to 400 feet, maximum altitude that weather permitted, and turned toward the fighting. Turnbull spotted the battle immediately. Smoke marked positions. Muzzle flashes revealed machine gun locations. He radioed his flight. They'd make strafing runs parallel to the Australian advance. Hit Japanese positions 50 yards ahead of friendly troops. Danger close. He rolled into attack. The jungle canopy rushed up. He opened fire at 200 yards. Tracers walked across Japanese positions. He saw soldiers falling, saw others scrambling for cover. Pulled up at 100 feet, trees flashing past his wingtips. The second Kittyhawk followed, then third, then fourth. They made 3 passes in 6 minutes. Japanese defensive fire was intense, but poorly aimed. The surprise had been total. When the fighters pulled off, Japanese resistance along that section collapsed. On the ground, Stewart's company surged forward. The airstrike had stunned the defenders. D Company overran 3 positions in 15 minutes. They captured documents, maps, ammunition. More importantly, they captured confidence. The Japanese weren't invincible after all, but 7 miles east, at the Japanese beachhead, Admiral Matsuyama was preparing his response. He'd received reports of the Australian counterattack. It was stronger than expected. His forces were being pushed back. Time to commit reserves. He ordered the Yokosuka 5th Special Naval Landing Force, his best unit held in reserve, to counterattack immediately. 400 fresh Marines. They would hit the Australian left flank, overrun the weakened 61st Battalion, drive to the airstrips, end this battle. The counterattack launched at 9:15 a.m. Japanese Marines advanced in 2 waves. They used the coastal track, counting on speed and shock. They moved with frightening precision. each squad covering the next, leapfrogging forward. Professional infantry warfare. The 61st Battalion saw them coming. Private McRae, still at his position from 2 days earlier, watched the Japanese approach. There were so many. His company numbered maybe 80 effectives. The Japanese looked like hundreds. His hands started shaking again. The Japanese opened fire at 400 yards. Rifle and machine gun fire swept the Australian positions. McRae pressed into his foxhole. Bullets cracked overhead. Someone nearby screamed. The Japanese kept advancing. 300 yards, 200. Australian artillery responded. Shells dropped among the advancing Japanese. Explosions threw bodies into the air. But the Marines kept coming. The casualties barely slowed them. 150 yards, 100. Would the line hold? McRae's section commander gave the order. Open fire. Every weapon engaged simultaneously. The Japanese first wave staggered. Men fell, but the second wave was right behind. They closed to grenade range. Grenades flew both directions. Explosions erupted across the battlefield. The Japanese reached the Australian foxholes. Fighting became close quarters. McRae shot a Japanese Marine climbing into his position. The man fell back. Another took his place. McRae's rifle jammed. He grabbed his bayonet. The Japanese soldier had one too. They lunged at each other. McRae slipped in the mud. Fell. The Japanese soldier raised his bayonet for the killing thrust. A shot. The Japanese soldier fell sideways. McRae looked up. Corporal Davies stood there, rifle smoking. Davies pulled McRae up. They had to move. The position was being overrun. The 61st Battalion fell back. Not rout, controlled withdrawal, but they gave ground. The Japanese advanced 500 yards in 20 minutes. They were getting closer to the airstrips. At 10:30 a.m., catastrophe loomed. If the Japanese captured number 3 strip, the Kittyhawks would lose their forward base. The entire air support network would collapse. Australian infantry would face Japanese Marines without air cover. Defeat seemed inevitable. Then weather intervened. A massive squall swept across Milne Bay. Rain fell in sheets. Visibility dropped to arm's length. The Japanese advance halted. They couldn't see, couldn't coordinate. They dug in where they stood. The squall lasted 40 minutes. When it cleared, the battlefield had transformed. The Australians had reinforced the threatened sector. 2 companies from the 210th Battalion had moved into position. Fresh troops, well positioned. The Japanese faced a wall of rifles and machine guns, but the squall had done something else. It flooded the coastal track, turned it into a river of mud. Japanese supply lines broke down. Ammunition couldn't reach forward units. Food couldn't reach hungry Marines. Medical supplies couldn't reach casualties. The invasion force began to fracture. At midday, Close made his decision. Time for maximum effort. He ordered all available forces forward. Every battalion would attack simultaneously. The Kittyhawks would fly continuous strikes. The Japanese would be overwhelmed by sheer pressure. At 1:47 p.m., the general assault began. Artillery barrage, infantry advance, airstrikes, everything coordinated. The Japanese defense buckled. They fell back to secondary positions, then to tertiary positions, then to the beachhead itself. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces were in full retreat. Turnbull led the final airstrike of the day. 8 Kittyhawks, every serviceable aircraft. They caught Japanese troops concentrated on the beach. The slaughter was terrible. Machine gun fire ripped through exposed infantry. Men dove into the water. Some drowned. Others were shot trying to swim. The beach turned red. When the fighters pulled off, Japanese casualties littered the shoreline. The survivors huddled in whatever cover they could find. Their invasion had failed. They knew it. The Australians knew it. The question now was whether the Japanese would withdraw or fight to annihilation. That night, August 27th, Japanese commanders held emergency conference. Admiral Matsuyama faced reality. His forces had lost momentum. lost supplies, lost air superiority, lost confidence. Continuing the operation would result in complete destruction. He made the hardest decision of his career. At midnight, he ordered withdrawal. The remaining Japanese forces would evacuate under cover of darkness. Destroyers would extract them. The invasion of Milne Bay was over. Japan had suffered its first land defeat of the Pacific War. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Japanese losses: 750 killed from the initial landing force of 1943, a casualty rate of 39%. The Kure 5th Special Naval Landing Force effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Only 1318 Marines made it back to the evacuation destroyers. Of those, 487 were wounded. The elite formation that had landed with such confidence limped home shattered. Australian casualties were significant but sustainable. 161 killed, 212 wounded from forces engaged. The 61st Battalion took the hardest losses, 1/3 casualties, but they'd held. The 210th and 212th Battalions proved militia could fight as effectively as regulars when properly led and supported. The RAAF lost 3 Kittyhawks, 1 to ground fire, 2 to operational accidents on the flooded runway. But those 17 fighters had flown 104 combat sorties in 5 days. They dropped 187 bombs and fired approximately 180,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Japanese documents captured later revealed their attacks had caused severe disruption. One report stated, "Enemy air attacks proved decisive factor in operational failure. What broke the Japanese wasn't superior numbers or better equipment. It was integrated warfare. The tactical impact rippled across the Pacific." MacArthur's headquarters analyzed the battle within days. The key lesson: Japanese forces could be defeated through coordination of ground and air assets. The myth of invincibility was shattered. American and Australian commanders gained confidence. The defensive mindset that had prevailed since Pearl Harbor began shifting to offensive planning. At Guadalcanal, where Marines were fighting desperate battles, news of Milne Bay boosted morale enormously. If Australians could defeat Japanese Marines in the jungle, so could Americans. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical victory. Suddenly, winning the Pacific War seemed possible rather than merely hopeful. But the strategic implications went deeper. Japan's entire New Guinea strategy depended on capturing Port Moresby. Milne Bay represented the eastern approach. With that route closed, Japanese forces had to rely on the Kokoda Track, a jungle trail across mountains where logistics became nightmarish. The failure at Milne Bay constrained Japanese options for the remainder of the New Guinea campaign. Could Japan have won the Pacific War if Milne Bay had fallen? The question haunted Japanese planners. The answer was probably no. American industrial power would eventually prevail. But Milne Bay accelerated the timeline. It shortened the war by months, perhaps years. The intelligence breakthrough proved equally significant. Allied code breakers had intercepted Japanese reinforcement orders. That intelligence had allowed precise planning. After Milne Bay, commanders trusted signals intelligence. The willingness to act on decoded messages increased. By 1943, this trust would produce dramatic results. The ambush of Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft, the victory at Philippine Sea, the destruction of merchant convoys. Milne Bay established the template. Break the codes, read enemy intentions, position forces accordingly, win battles. The integration of air and ground forces became standard doctrine. Before Milne Bay, coordination was loose. Air forces attacked when convenient, ground forces advanced when possible. After Milne Bay, planners insisted on tight integration. Air-ground liaison officers joined every battalion. Radio networks improved. Coordination became science rather than art. By 1944, this doctrine would enable the island-hopping campaign. Marines would assault beaches, while fighters and bombers provided continuous support. The technique proved so effective that Japanese forces rarely lasted more than weeks on defended islands. Milne Bay pioneered the tactics, that won the Pacific. The Kittyhawk itself gained respect. Before Milne Bay, the P-40 was considered obsolete. Slower than Zeros, less maneuverable, outclassed in dogfights. But Milne Bay proved the Kittyhawk excelled at ground attack. Its rugged construction absorbed battle damage. Its 6 machine guns destroyed ground targets effectively. Its dive speed exceeded most fighters. Post-war analysis revealed an interesting detail. The weather that seemed so problematic actually favored the defenders. Japanese Zeros couldn't operate from distant bases in those conditions. If weather had been clear, Japanese air superiority might have changed the outcome. The rain and clouds that soaked Turnbull's pilots also protected them from enemy fighters. The human stories carried forward decades. Private McRae survived the war. He returned to Brisbane, married, raised 4 children. He rarely spoke about Milne Bay. The memories were too intense, but his daughter found his diary after his death in 1987. The entries from August 1942 revealed terror and courage intertwined. One passage read, "Thought I would die, thought we all would. Then Corporal Davies pulled me up. Sometimes surviving is just about standing up one more time." Corporal Davies received the Distinguished Conduct Medal for actions at Milne Bay. He survived the war, but died in 1953 from complications related to malaria contracted in New Guinea. At his funeral, 12 veterans from the 61st Battalion attended. They'd stayed connected. The bonds formed in that jungle lasted lifetimes. Turnbull rose to group captain by war's end. He commanded fighter squadrons through the remainder of the Pacific Campaign. In 1958, he wrote a memoir. The chapter on Milne Bay was titled simply, "When Weather Became Weapon." He described flying at treetop height through rain squalls, never knowing if the next second would bring trees or targets. He wrote, "We were terrified and determined simultaneously. Fear never left, but neither did duty." Sergeant Walsh recovered from his wounds. His leg never fully healed. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. But he returned to Brisbane, became a school teacher, taught history. Every year, he devoted one class to Milne Bay. He showed his students the scars. He explained what jungle warfare felt like. He made them understand that history wasn't abstract. It was young men bleeding in mud, fighting for something larger than themselves. The Japanese survivors carried different lessons home. Captain Yano, who commanded a company in the Kure 5th, wrote in his report, "Australian defenders demonstrated superior coordination and morale. Our intelligence failed to assess enemy capability accurately. The defeat at Milne Bay should prompt revision of operational assumptions." His superiors ignored the report. They would learn the same lessons again at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Saipan. By 1945, every Japanese officer studied Milne Bay as example of what not to do. Launch amphibious operations without air superiority. Underestimate defenders. Ignore logistics. Assume enemy will break easily. The lessons were written in blood, but they were learned. The airstrip at Milne Bay continued operating through 1943. It supported operations against Rabaul, Lae, and Finschhafen. By 1944, the front had moved north. The strip fell into disuse. Today, jungle has reclaimed much of it. Occasional tourists visit. They walk the coastal track where the 61st Battalion fought. They see rusted equipment slowly disappearing into undergrowth. They try to imagine what happened there. Local Papua New Guineans preserve some memories. Old men tell stories their fathers told them. Stories of the night the Japanese came, of the battles in the jungle, of the strange aircraft that flew so low you could see the pilots. The stories become legend, but the core truth remains. Something important happened at Milne Bay in August 1942. That truth is simple. A collection of militia soldiers, flying mechanics working miracles, and pilots risking everything stopped an invasion that should have succeeded. They proved courage and coordination could overcome elite training and fearsome reputation. They demonstrated that integrated warfare, ground forces, air power, intelligence, was the path to victory. the terror that made 750 Japanese Marines. Retreat wasn't one thing. It was combination. Mud that swallowed equipment, rain that disrupted communications, air attacks that came without warning, defenders who wouldn't break despite being outmatched. It was the realization that this battle was different, that the pattern of easy victories had ended, that from this point forward, every yard would be contested. 65 words changed the Pacific War. They appeared in Admiral Matsuyama's after-action report, filed September 7, 1942. The failure at Milne Bay demonstrates that enemy defensive capabilities in difficult terrain, supported by coordinated air operations, can defeat superior forces. Future operations must account for these factors. The assumption of inevitable victory must be revised. The enemy has learned to fight effectively in jungle conditions, previously thought to favor Japanese forces. Those words meant Japan could no longer rely on reputation for invincibility, could no longer assume intimidation would break defenders, could no longer ignore logistics, coordination, and integrated warfare. The lessons of Milne Bay forced strategic revision. The Pacific War's trajectory bent toward Allied victory because of what happened in a swamp in Papua New Guinea during 12 days in August 1942. In the darkness before dawn on August 25th, privates, McRae couldn't see his hands shaking. By September 7th, he and thousands like him had discovered something unexpected. They could face elite enemy forces and prevail. That discovery echoed across oceans, changed strategies, saved lives, shortened a war. One battle, one lesson, one undeniable truth. Courage, multiplied by coordination, produces victory.